So the issue I want to address today is political aspects of disputes between Belarus and Russia. Now, this is hardly new. There have been frictions in the relationship going back for a long time. However, I would contend that there's a qualitative difference between some of the recent disputes and some of those that occurred in the early 2000s. Although there was a certain politicisation of many of the earlier disputes, these were at root economic. For example, in their origins, for example, the gas spats of 2004, 2007, and concerning various duties and tariffs. And this is fairly logical in that Belarus had emerged from the USSR, heavily dependent economically on Russia, and I don't think after 1994 there was much serious consideration of changing that. Moreover, these disputes occurred against a faltering backdrop of reintegration through the Union state of Russia and Belarus. But more recently, issues of sovereignty and military cooperation have been the subject of quarrel between the two sides. Most infamously, the non-recognition formally by Belarus of South Ossetia and Abkhazia in 2008, but also in 2010, Belarus taking a different position from Russia on the ousting of Kyrgyz President Kurmanbek Bakiyev, and apparently resisting Russian demands recently for an airbase at Ostrogorski. In light of the fact that Russia and Belarus are allies formally through the Collective Security and Treaty Organisation, informally in a bilateral sense, and given the rising instability in world politics, these disputes between partners look increasingly problematic from outside. Whilst quarrels between allies remain of low intensity, we can expect that the shared interest of being in an alliance will prevail. But if poorly managed, such disputes risk escalating, and this can lead to the deterioration of the alliance. It can ultimately call the alliance itself into question. So what I want to do here today is just draw on the literature about alliance politics in order to offer some explanation of these recent disputes. In particular, I intend to argue that the Belarusian leadership have started to ask more questions about Russia's policy preferences and intentions. I intend to make two broad points. First, that the Belarusian leadership seeks to avoid losing support from the Kremlin. But secondly, that Belarus's leaders seek to avoid being entrapped in Russia's disputes with other states. And my contention is that considering the tactics this small ally employs in an asymmetrical alliance, offer the most plausible explanation for these. There are alternative explanations for these political frictions, and I shall briefly mention two. One alternative would be to focus nonetheless on the economic ties between Russia and Belarus. There's a recent book by Margarita Balmaceda, which is a very good analysis of energy relations, and she looks at domestic rent-seeking behaviour within Belarus, but also rent-seeking behaviour at the level of the international system as an explanatory variable. Contextually, this is very important, undoubtedly. One might argue that reduced Russian energy subsidies have raised the stakes, and that more political disputes are simply a reflection of this. I'll try to indicate why I don't think this is fully persuasive when I outline my argument, but I think, in general, Belarus understands that if it wants to increase its bargaining power with Russia, then it really needs to decrease its dependence. Another alternative explanation would be to argue that Belarus is seeking some form of strategic reorientation, and this includes the notions of balancing that Andrew mentioned and neutrality that Sergei has brought up. And again, there's an important contribution here, but I want to show how this can be situated within the scope of alliance management behaviour. By balancing, I understand this slightly differently to my moderator. I understand balancing to mean providing a counterweight against a perceived threat. And there's not sufficient evidence in order to argue that Belarus is seeking to abandon Russia anytime soon. So balancing behaviour would require the forming of coalitions with other states as a counterweight to Russia. Now this simply has not happened. Granted, that may be through the lack of alternative allies, but I would expect at least to see greater cooperation with other CIS states before we could really talk of balancing. Moreover, the Belarus-Russia alliance is grounded in a lot of other considerations that are not merely strategic, ethnic, historical, and for the time being at least, Belarus's leaders consider these significant. So what I want to do is draw on a few ideas about alliance behaviour, and this draws on the work of Michael Mandelbaum, Glenn Snyder and Stephen Walt. Alliances vary enormously in terms of their size and their scope. Some are formed and regulated through treaties, others are a lot more informal. But generally we understand that an alliance is formed in relation to an external threat. However, within the alliance as well, each member has a series of goals which reflects what the literature sometimes calls the alliance security dilemma. By this, I mean the trade-off between security on the one hand and autonomy on the other. So in order to maintain an alliance, members can do various things. They can barter about the terms of the alliance, they can barter about the common position to be taken vis-à-vis a particular adversary. But this alliance security dilemma, security versus autonomy, is always present. And the positions that each alliance partner takes on certain issues can strengthen or weaken the position in respect of the ally, as well as strengthen or weaken the alliance itself. So as the smaller partner in an alliance with Russia, Belarus faces a number of risks to its sovereignty from Russia. First, Belarus faces the risk of abandonment, by which I mean Russia deserting it when it needs Russian support. In order to guard against abandonment, an alliance member strengthens its commitment and affirms its loyalty. This is the opposite of the observations that I'm interested in here, from which I infer that fear of abandonment is not an overriding concern for Belarus's leaders recently. Secondly, Belarus faces the risk of entrapment. By this, I mean being drawn into a war due to its alliance commitments. In order to guard against entrapment, an alliance member reduces its commitments or threatens to withhold support from its ally. It may threaten to defect from the alliance. As an example of such behaviour, there have been a couple of occasions in the past where Belarus has expressed its reluctance to...
You got some penguin.
Belarus has expressed its reluctance to commit military troops outside of its own borders. For a while in 2009, Alexander Lukashenko resisted signing Belarus up to the CSTO's collective rapid response force, in effect saying that he was not wanting to be entrapped in a war in Central Asia. This is not a national interest of Belarus, though it is a national interest of Russia. Thirdly, Belarus faces the risk of conquest, either through occupation or annexation. In order to guard against this, Belarus seeks to appease its alliance partner and deflect attention onto other states. Lastly, Belarus faces the risk of penetration, by which I mean that the idea that Russia establishes a position whereby it can manipulate Belarusian domestic politics to suit its needs. So what evidence is there to support my claim that these are the concerns behind some of Belarus's recent frictions with Russia? I'm going to mention two cases just to demonstrate some of these points. First, I would like to cast our mind back to the Kyrgyz revolution of the second Kyrgyz revolution in 2010. This is the one that ousted Bakiyev. So to recall, there were street protests. Bakiyev tendered his resignation. He fled to Minsk. where he was given shelter, and according to some sources, he's subsequently been granted Belarusian citizenship. Following Bakiyev's flight, Russia expected that Belarus would extradite Bakiyev back to Bishkek in accordance with Article 66 of the Kishinev Convention, which all three states had signed in 2002. However, Belarus dug its heels in. It did not welcome the regime change in Bishkek, and this put it at odds with the Medvedev government that was dealing with the interim government under Rosa Otunbayeva. I don't have time to go into too much detail here, but it's pretty clear in my mind that the presidential administration in Minsk, rightly or wrongly, suspected that Russia was behind the ousting of Bakiyev. The state-controlled newspapers printed a host of articles from the Western press pointing the blame at Moscow, not always from obvious sources. We don't routinely expect to find articles from the Washington Times quoted in Zvezda. Moreover, Bakiyev's retraction of his resignation and claim that it was tendered under pressure from Russia was reported at length in most of the state newspapers, all of the state newspapers, in fact. The statements and speeches from President Lukashenko at this time indicate that the presidential administration were considering how its alliance with Russia was a threat to its autonomy. In his annual message to the Belarusian people and the National Assembly, Lukashenko said that Russia was engaged in systematic actions which question the survival of our state. Thus, his assertion that there would be no colour revolution in Belarus was directed at Russia as much as it was the West. On the 15th of April, Lukashenko asked why the CSTO had not convened to discuss recent events in Kyrgyzstan and implied that this was Russia's decision. We might reasonably ask why the CSTO would convene in these circumstances. Kyrgyzstan, so far as I'm aware, was not under external attack, but I would submit that this makes some sense if we interpret that the authorities in Belarus saw this as an alliance issue. My point here is that in responding to Kyrgyz events, Belarus sought to delimit the scope of the alliance and underline that support for Russia was not unconditional. Reducing commitments to Russia increased Belarus's bargaining power within the alliance. So this is a response to fears of penetration, especially the risk that Russia might withdraw its support for the incumbent government and seek regime change in Minsk. The second case I want to touch on is one which Sergei also mentioned, which was that Russia did not give any public support to Turkey following the shooting down of a fighter jet last year. Withholding support, as I mentioned, is a tactic employed to avoid entrapment. Publicly supporting Russia would prospectively have emboldened Russia to attack Turkey. It would, at least, have increased the likelihood. I think it's fair to say that there are some in Moscow who doubt NATO member states' commitment to defending Turkey. As in this case, as with the Kyrgyz one, the Belarusian authorities' refusal to parrot the rhetoric of Russia is most plausibly explained as an example of managing the alliance with Russia. It's weakly explained, in my view, in terms of patron-client relations, rent-seeking behaviour, or in terms of any genuine strategic reorientation or neutrality or balancing. In wrapping up, I recognise that I've explained frictions here solely from the perspective of Belarus. Well, that's because we're here to talk about Belarus. But this is clearly a limitation, and many people would seek to explain some of these issues from the Russian side. I hope I've shown why considering the smaller allies' interests can't be discounted here. Generally, the scholarship finds that small allies can be surprisingly tenacious when they consider that their national interests are under threat. In the case of Kyrgyzstan, there is another relevant consideration, which is the personal friendship of Bakiyev and Lukashenko. And I would simply say that this brings me to the same conclusion. It only meant that Lukashenko believed Bakiyev when he told him that Russia had done certain bad things that had led to his ousting. I want to make a closing remark about the Ukraine crisis, because in some sense this has given Belarus a taste of outside states respecting its ostensibly independent foreign policy. During the crisis, Belarus has arguably tried to adopt a foreign policy of specialization by serving as a venue for peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. By specialization, I mean what the historian Paul Schroeder describes as finding a role in international relations that other states value. This is a foreign policy that can provide smaller states with security in spite of limited defence capabilities. However, to consolidate this position would not really be possible, all the while Belarus talks of itself as being an ally of Russia.
Thank you, Paul.